January 26, 1945. The Colmar Pocket, eastern France. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets across the frozen fields near Holtzwihr, a small Alsatian village that had changed hands so many times between armies that its name had become synonymous with death. The temperature hovered just below zero. Steam rose from the burning hulks of American tanks, black smoke twisting into the colorless sky like the prayers of dying men. The ground was hard as iron, and the air smelled of cordite, diesel fuel, and something sweet and terrible, the scent of burning flesh mixed with winter pine. On this morning, a single American soldier stood alone on a burning tank destroyer, a telephone receiver pressed to his ear, directing artillery fire onto an advancing wall of German infantry and armor that stretched as far as the eye could see. His name was Audie Murphy. He was 20 years old, and he was about to refuse death itself. The German 19th Army had been encircled in the Colmar Pocket since November, a stubborn bulge in the Allied lines that represented the last significant German presence west of the Rhine. Hitler had ordered them to hold at all costs, to bleed the Americans and French, to buy time for the fatherland. The Führer's directives were absolute. Every village, every frozen field, every shattered farmhouse was to become a fortress. Retreat was treason. Surrender was unthinkable. The men of the German 19th Army understood what this meant. They would die in the snow of Alsace, but they would die as National Socialists, defending the sacred soil of the Reich's stolen territories. They had been promised that one more winter offensive, one more concentrated push, would break the exhausted American forces and restore the initiative. They had been told that the Americans were soft, that their democracy made them weak, that their love of comfort would crumble under sustained pressure. They believed this. They had to believe this. Audie Murphy had believed something different once. He had believed in the simple dignity of survival, in keeping his family fed during the Depression years in rural Texas, in the uncomplicated morality of defending your country when it called. He had enlisted in 1942, a skinny farm boy with a baby face who stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 112 pounds. The Marine Corps had rejected him for being too small. The paratroopers turned him away for the same reason. The infantry took him because the infantry took everyone eventually. He had landed in Sicily in 1943, fought his way through Italy, stormed ashore in southern France, and survived the frozen hell of the Vosges Mountains. By January 1945, he had killed so many German soldiers that he had stopped counting. He had won the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with oak leaf cluster, 2 bronze stars, 3 Purple Hearts. He commanded Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, though he still carried the rank of 2nd Lieutenant. His men called him Baby Face. The Germans called his company the Ghosts because they appeared from nowhere and killed with mechanical efficiency. But Murphy no longer believed in simple things. He had seen what men could do to each other when ideology gave them permission. He had seen the SS execute French civilians for hiding Allied soldiers. He had seen German teenagers, members of the Hitler Youth, throw themselves at American machine guns with religious fervor, dying for a Führer who would never learn their names. He had seen his best friend cut in half by German artillery. He had learned that survival was not about belief. It was about mathematics, about calculating angles of fire and vulnerable approaches, about understanding that in the moment of contact, the only thing that mattered was whether you pulled the trigger first. War had not made him ideological. It had made him pragmatic. And on the morning of January 26, 1945, that pragmatism would save his life and the lives of every man in his company. The attack had begun at dawn. German forces, 6 Panzer tanks, several self-propelled guns, and approximately 250 infantry soldiers emerged from the Bois de Redouire, advancing across open ground toward the American positions outside Holtzwihr. Murphy's company had been reduced to just 40 men, exhausted from days of continuous combat. They held a fragile defensive line along a tree line, supported by 2 M10 tank destroyers. The German plan was simple and brutal. Overwhelm the American position with concentrated armor and infantry, punch through the weakened line, and restore German control of the vital crossroads. The Wehrmacht soldiers advancing through the snow that morning expected resistance, certainly, but they expected American resistance, which meant they expected pragmatism, withdrawal under pressure, rational calculation of survival. They had been taught that Americans fought for abstractions, democracy, freedom, distant homelands across an ocean. They fought for blood and soil, for the physical earth beneath their boots, for the survival of their race and civilization. This, their officers had told them, made them superior. This made them inevitable. What they encountered instead was a young man who had already decided he would not move. The first tank destroyer was hit within minutes of the engagement, a German round punching through its thin armor and detonating the ammunition inside. The crew bailed out, some of them on fire, rolling in the snow to extinguish the flames that consumed their uniforms. The second tank destroyer, positioned 40 yards ahead of Murphy's position, began to burn after taking multiple hits. Its crew abandoned the vehicle and fell back toward the tree line. Murphy watched the German infantry advance, using the cover of their tanks, moving in disciplined waves across the frozen fields. He understood immediately that if the Germans reached the tree line, his company would be overrun. They would be flanked, encircled, and destroyed in detail. He had perhaps 5 minutes to make a decision. He ran forward through the snow toward the burning tank destroyer. His men shouted at him to come back. "Lieutenant Murphy," they called, "get down, get back, you'll be killed." But Murphy had already performed the mathematics. The M10 carried a functional radio, a direct line to American artillery positions in the rear. The vehicle's .50 caliber machine gun was still operational, its ammunition belt intact. From the position of the burning destroyer, he would have clear fields of fire across the approaching German infantry. The vehicle was already burning, which meant the Germans would assume it was abandoned, would not prioritize it as a target. His own survival had become a tactical asset. His death, if it came, would at least buy time. He climbed onto the destroyer's hull, ignoring the heat that radiated through the metal, and picked up the telephone receiver. He cranked the handle. The line connected. "This is Lieutenant Murphy," he said, his voice steady despite the machine gun fire that now stitched the snow around him. "I need fire missions on German infantry, coordinates to follow. Start adjusting rounds on my command." For the next hour, Audie Murphy became a conductor of annihilation. He directed American artillery onto the advancing German infantry with surgical precision, calling in adjustments while simultaneously firing the .50 caliber machine gun in controlled bursts. The Germans were caught in the open, pinned between the artillery, rounds that exploded among their ranks, and the machine gun fire that cut down anyone who attempted to close the distance. German soldiers who had marched through the snow with confidence now threw themselves flat, crawling through the frozen ground, trying to find cover where none existed. Their tanks continued to advance, but without infantry support, they became vulnerable, exposed targets for American anti-tank weapons. Murphy's position should have been untenable. German machine gun fire hammered the tank destroyer continuously, rounds sparking off the metal hull, whining past his head close enough that he could feel the displacement of air. German snipers targeted him specifically, recognizing that the artillery fire was being directed by someone on that burning vehicle. A Panzer tank rotated its turret toward his position and fired. The round struck the tracks of the destroyer, the concussion nearly throwing Murphy from the hull. His uniform caught fire. He beat out the flames with his bare hands and continued firing. The metal beneath his feet grew so hot that his boots began to smoke, the rubber soles melting against the superheated armor. He ignored this. The telephone line remained connected. The artillery continued to fall. The German infantry had been trained to recognize when an attack had failed, when losses became unsustainable, when the tactical situation demanded withdrawal. But they had also been trained that withdrawal without orders was punishable by death, that the will of the Führer superseded the mathematics of the battlefield. So they continued to advance, because advance was the only option their ideology permitted. They climbed over their own dead, teenagers conscripted from Bavaria and Saxony, veterans evacuated from the Eastern Front, men who believed that National Socialism represented the apex of human civilization, that their sacrifice would be remembered in the 1,000-year Reich. They believed this even as American artillery turned the snow red, even as the machine gun fire from the burning tank destroyer cut them down in windrows. Murphy had stopped thinking in terms of individual targets. He fired at concentrations, at movements, at anything that represented a threat to the mathematical equation he had constructed in his mind. Hold this position long enough for his company to reorganize, long enough for reinforcements to arrive, long enough that the German attack collapsed under its own weight. He was not being heroic. He was being efficient. The .50 caliber machine gun bucked against his hands, the heat from the barrel visible even in the daylight, and he continued to fire because firing was the only variable he could control. The German company commander, observing the attack's failure from his position behind the advancing armor, could not comprehend what he was witnessing. A single American soldier, standing on a burning vehicle, had stalled an entire assault. This violated everything he understood about warfare, about national character, about the weakness inherent in democratic societies. Americans were supposed to value individual life above collective victory. They were supposed to retreat when faced with overwhelming force. They were supposed to be rational. This soldier was not rational. This soldier was holding a position that could not be held, surviving fire that should have killed him 10 times over, refusing to acknowledge that he was defeated. The company commander adjusted his field glasses and watched as another squad of his infantry went down under American artillery fire. He realized, with a cold clarity that felt like treason, that he had been lied to. The Americans were not weak. They were simply fighting for something different, and that something made them very dangerous. After 50 minutes of continuous combat, the German attack broke. The infantry withdrew in disorder, leaving their dead and wounded scattered across the blood-stained snow. The panzers reversed course, their commanders recognizing that without infantry support, they would be destroyed by American anti-tank guns. Murphy maintained his position, directing artillery onto the retreating Germans until they disappeared back into the Bois de Holtzwihr. Only then did he climb down from the tank destroyer, his uniform still smoking, his hands blistered and bleeding from the superheated metal of the machine gun, his face blackened with soot and cordite residue. His company had held. Not a single American position had been overrun. The German attack, 6 tanks, 250 infantry, had been repulsed with catastrophic losses. German casualties numbered over 50 dead and countless wounded. American casualties in Murphy's immediate sector, 0 fatalities during the engagement itself. Murphy had personally killed or wounded an estimated 50 German soldiers, though the exact number would never be known because the snow covered everything, and the Wehrmacht did not file reports on defeats. When Murphy returned to the tree line, his men stared at him as if he had returned from the dead. Perhaps he had. The medics treated his burns and the shrapnel wounds he had not noticed during the fighting. His company commander recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Murphy's response was characteristically pragmatic. "I just did what needed doing. Someone had to stay on that phone." But what Murphy had done transcended tactical necessity. He had, through sheer refusal to accept defeat, demolished a foundational myth of the Nazi regime, that Americans were too individualistic, too soft, too comfortable to stand and die when death became necessary. The German soldiers who survived the assault at Holtzwihr carried back to their units a terrible knowledge that American democracy did not make men weak. It made them unpredictable. It gave them the freedom to choose their own deaths, to make individual decisions that sometimes bordered on the suicidal, because those decisions were not dictated by ideology, but by conscience. Murphy had not stood on that burning tank destroyer because the Führer commanded it, or because party doctrine demanded it, or because retreat meant a bullet from a political officer. He had done it because he decided his men's lives were worth more than his own, and in a democracy, he was free to make that choice. The Medal of Honor citation, when it arrived months later, described Murphy's actions with bureaucratic precision. 2nd Lieutenant Murphy commanded Company B, which was attacked by 6 tanks and waves of infantry. 2D Lieutenant Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to prepared positions in a woods, while he remained forward at his command post and continued to give fire directions to the artillery by telephone. Behind him, to his right, one of our tank destroyers received a direct hit and began to burn. Its crew withdrew to the woods. 2D Lieutenant Murphy continued to direct artillery fire, which killed large numbers of the advancing enemy infantry. With the enemy tanks abreast of his position, 2D Lieutenant Murphy climbed on the burning tank destroyer, which was in danger of blowing up at any moment, and employed its .50 caliber machine gun against the enemy. He was alone and exposed to German fire from 3 sides, but his deadly fire killed dozens of Germans and caused their infantry attack to waver. The enemy tanks, losing infantry support, began to fall back. For an hour, the Germans tried every available weapon to eliminate 2D Lieutenant Murphy, but he continued to hold his position and wiped out a squad, which was trying to creep up unnoticed on his right flank. Germans reached as close as 10 yards, only to be mowed down by his fire. He received a leg wound, but ignored it and continued the single-handed fight until his ammunition was exhausted. He then made his way to his company, refused medical attention, and organized the company in a counterattack which forced the Germans to withdraw. His directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50. 2D Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction, and enabled it to hold the woods which had been the enemy's objective. The citation did not mention, because citations never do, what Murphy carried back with him from that frozen field. It did not describe the nightmares that would follow him for the rest of his life, the way he would sleep with a loaded pistol under his pillow, the way sudden noises would send him diving for cover decades after the war ended. It did not explain that he had crossed a threshold that morning, that he had learned something about himself that could never be unlearned, that he was capable of killing with mechanical efficiency, that he could watch men die through the sights of a machine gun and feel nothing but the satisfaction of a tactical problem solved. The democracy he had defended gave him the freedom to become this, and it gave him the freedom to live with what he had become. The Colmar pocket was eliminated by early February 1945. The German 19th Army was destroyed as an effective fighting force. The Rhine River crossings proceeded on schedule. Audie Murphy survived the war as the most decorated American combat soldier, recipient of every valor decoration the United States could bestow, including medals from France and Belgium. He returned home to a hero's welcome, became a movie star, played himself in the film adaptation of his autobiography. He smiled for cameras and signed autographs, and never spoke publicly about what it felt like to stand on a burning tank with German machine gun fire tearing the air around him, calling in artillery on men who were just following orders, just like he was. In his private journals, discovered after his death in a plane crash in 1971, Murphy wrote about Holtzwihr only once. "I don't know why I didn't die that day. Maybe I was already dead, and just too stubborn to lie down." This was as close as he ever came to explaining the mathematics of that morning, the calculation that his death mattered less than his defiance, that sometimes surviving was not about believing in victory, but about refusing to accept defeat. The democracy he defended had given him that choice. The ideology he faced had taken that choice away from the men advancing through the snow toward him. The burned-out hulk of the M10 tank destroyer remained in the field outside Holtzwihr for months after the battle, a blackened monument to what one man with a telephone and a machine gun could accomplish. French civilians placed flowers around it, though they did not know exactly what had happened there, only that Americans had died to liberate their village. Eventually the wreckage was hauled away for scrap, the metal recycled, the physical evidence of Murphy's stand erased by the practical necessities of reconstruction. But the German veterans who survived the assault never forgot. In letters and memoirs published decades later, they described the attack on Holtzwihr as unmöglich, impossible. A single American soldier should not have been able to stop an armored assault. The mathematics did not permit it. But mathematics could not account for will, and ideology could not predict the choices free men make when they decide that some ground is worth holding regardless of cost. The symbolic weight of that burned tank destroyer, that iron coffin that Murphy transformed into a fortress, resonates beyond the tactical details of a single engagement. In the Nazi imagination, the tank represented modernity, industrial power, the superiority of German engineering and military science. It was supposed to be unstoppable, the material embodiment of willpower and racial destiny made manifest in steel and high-velocity cannon. That a lone American soldier could climb onto a burning wreck of American machinery and use it to destroy German armor and infantry was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a symbolic refutation of everything the Reich claimed to represent. American abundance had not made Murphy soft. It had given him options. American democracy had not made him weak. It had taught him that his life was his own to spend as he chose. And in the frozen hell of Holtzwihr, Audie Murphy chose to spend it buying time for his men to live. The Germans advancing through that snow had been taught that death in service to the Führer was the highest calling, that individual life mattered only insofar as it served the collective destiny of the Volk. Murphy's stand demonstrated the terrible flaw in that logic, that free men fighting for each other, bound by choice rather than coercion, could summon reserves of courage that ideology could never match. The Germans died because they had been ordered to advance. Murphy survived because he had chosen to stay. In that distinction lay the entire moral architecture of the war. There is a photograph of Audie Murphy taken 3 days after the battle at Holtzwihr. He sits on an ammunition crate, a cigarette burning between his fingers, his 1,000-yard stare fixed on something beyond the camera's frame. His face is still that of a boy, but his eyes belong to someone much older, someone who has seen the mathematics of death up close and learned its arithmetic. He is wearing a fresh uniform, his burns bandaged beneath the sleeves, and he is smiling slightly, not with joy, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who has survived what should have killed him. The photograph was used in American newspapers, with headlines celebrating the baby-faced lieutenant who had single-handedly stopped a German attack. What the photograph could not show was the weight he would carry for the rest of his life, the knowledge that he had become very good at killing, and that this skill had been necessary and righteous and utterly unforgivable all at once. When Murphy died in that plane crash in 1971, at the age of 45, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His headstone is identical to all the others, a simple white marker bearing his name, rank, and dates of service. It does not mention the Medal of Honor or the 50 German soldiers he killed in a single hour, or the fact that he spent the last decades of his life advocating for veterans suffering from what we now call PTSD. It certainly does not explain that on a frozen morning in January 1945, a young man from rural Texas decided that some things were worth dying for, and then proceeded to prove that he was very difficult to kill. The snow falls on Holtzwihr still, covering the fields where Murphy made his stand, erasing the scars that artillery and tank fire carved into the earth. The village has been rebuilt, prosperous and quiet, a place where tourists stop to take photographs and read plaques commemorating the liberation. There is a small museum dedicated to the battle, with faded photographs and rusted artifacts behind glass. The local schoolchildren learn about the American soldier who saved their village, though the details have been sanitized for young audiences, the blood and burning and screaming edited out to preserve the heroic narrative. But history is not made of narratives. It is made of choices, individual decisions rendered under conditions of absolute extremity, when the mathematics of survival collide with the calculus of duty, and the result is something that transcends both. Audie Murphy's choice to climb onto that burning tank destroyer was not heroic in conventional sense. It was practical, desperate, and coldly rational. What made it extraordinary was not the act itself, but the refusal embedded within it, the refusal to accept that the German advance was inevitable, that superior numbers guaranteed victory, that ideology could overcome will. In choosing to stay, Murphy affirmed something fundamental about the society he defended. That freedom included the freedom to sacrifice, that democracy empowered men to make hard choices rather than forcing them to follow orders, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal was a single stubborn soul who decided, against all mathematical probability, to refuse death one more time. That refusal echoes still, in the white headstones at Arlington, in the memories of veterans who understand what it means to hold ground that cannot be held, in the knowledge that tyranny always underestimates the resolve of free men until the moment that underestimation becomes fatal. Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr was not a miracle. It was a choice, the choice to believe that his men's lives mattered more than his own, that some ground was worth the price of standing, that democracy was not a weakness but a different kind of strength, unpredictable and sometimes terrible in its application. And in the end, that choice was enough. 1 American, 250 Germans, a burning tank destroyer and a telephone line, and 50 minutes of mathematics rendered in high explosives and machine gun fire. When the snow settled and the smoke cleared, and the count was made, freedom had held its ground, not because it was inevitable, but because one man decided it would. That decision, repeated across 1,000 frozen fields and shattered villages and contested ridges, was how tyranny was defeated. Not through grand strategy or superior resources, but through the accumulated weight of individual choices to stand when standing meant death, to fight when fighting seemed futile, to refuse the calculations of ideology in favor of the simple arithmetic of courage. The burned tank destroyer is gone now, recycled into the steel frames of post-war Europe. But the choice Murphy made that morning remains embedded in the soil of Holtzwihr like an unexploded shell, waiting for each new generation to discover what it means, that freedom is not free, that democracy demands defenders, and that sometimes the most powerful force on any battlefield is a young man with nothing left to lose who decides, despite everything, to refuse to die.